Mr. Zettelmeyer, how deep do you think that the European economies are going to be affected by the energy crisis? And I don't mean only the economies, and also the people. The people of the European Union are going to be affected by all that.
So, very, very deeply, but this is already something that is happening, no? So there has been a very big effect on living standards of some households. Some industrial sectors are being squeezed. And of course, it has had a big impact on inflation, and through inflation on the policies of the European Central Bank that have been now tightening interest rates, raising interest rates much faster than they anticipated only in December, right? So it has been felt very sharply, and it could get worse. And whether it gets worse will depend on three factors. One is the depth of the winter, whether it will be a cold winter or a mild winter. Second, the developments in Ukraine and the Russian actions. So Russia still supplies about 20% of the total supply that they did supply to Europe last year. So we are at this point no longer very dependent on Russia, of course, at the expense of very high gas prices, but it could still get worse. And then most importantly, it will depend on our own response to the crisis. And what we have advocated at Bruegel is essentially a cooperative response in which burdens across the European Union are shared as much as possible. So all countries commit to demand reduction, but also to raising supply to the extent that they can, and to a common position vis-à-vis external suppliers. So negotiating with external suppliers, not just about this winter, but in the longer term, a relationship for providing gas in particular to the European Union.
Negotiating as an EU, the same way that they did with the vaccines, you mean?
Yes, but in a much more relationship-focused long-term sense, right? So if you are merely negotiating about supplying gas in the next few months, it is basically a zero-sum game, right? So you're trying to get the price as low as possible, and the other side is going to try to do the opposite. But I think if we take a longer-term perspective, where we, for example, with respect to Norway, provide a perspective of how much gas we will need and at what terms over a longer term, then this can also guide investment decisions in those countries, and that will be very important. So we have to provide security to them as a reliable customer, and then they will give us terms that we can live with.
Well, do you believe that Europe should get completely rid of getting gas from Russia in the next decades, I can say, in the next 20 years, so that we will be completely independent from Russian gas
yes.
If they can negotiate good deals, and you say long term, with Norwegia or maybe even other countries?
No, I mean, we have to get rid of Russian gas dependence much faster than that, no? So at this point we are in a crisis, so I would not boycott the remaining 20% of Russian gas, but we certainly have to get rid of Russian gas by 2024 or something like that. And I'm almost certain it will happen earlier. So I'm pretty sure that they will cut off the rest as well very soon.
Are you afraid that maybe some of the countries or more of the countries will get into depression due to the energy crisis? Is that a fear that is a liable fear, or you don't see that coming? You don't predict something so bad?
So depression is a big word. I think what we are expecting, and I think most forecasters are expecting at this point, is negative growth in the EU as a whole in 2023, so there will be a recession, but it will not be equally distributed. It will affect countries more that are more sensitive to high energy prices, so the energy-intensive industries will be affected more. Certainly Germany will go into a significant recession. And then, the depth of it will depend on how well we work together.
Do you believe that the war in Ukraine has made EU work better together? And is that something that we can expect to last even after the war? Or EU works well only in big crises?
So it has definitely made the EU work better together so far. We are unfortunately seeing the first signs of EU cohesion falling apart, but it's too early to say how this will go. I think that the need to work together is so existential before the winter that it will hold. But there is a big risk. So essentially the risk is that if individual countries are viewed as not pulling their weight, particularly on reducing gas consumption, then at some point, another country will say, look, their consumption is eating our gas or raising prices for everyone. And then there will be an attempt to shut down internal markets in the EU and keep the gas inside national borders in the same way in which during the global financial and euro area crisis, some countries tried to keep liquidity, essentially bank funding, inside the national borders. And so that is the worst possible situation that will sort of destroy both political unity and make the crisis worse. If we manage to get through the winter without that, then I do think that this cooperation can last not just in this crisis, but in the longer term, because we would have, in a sense, rehearsed modalities of cooperation that can deepen the energy union, right? We would have put national interests in perspective. We would have put European interests first. And so that really can have a lasting effect, I think.
Do you still believe that the war will end in a logical time, or do you believe that it will last for more years? I mean, is it Russia's fault? Is it only Vladimir Putin? And maybe if he isn't in power, the war will end? Do you see in the foreseeable future an end to the war?
So I don't. So I'm not an expert in this area. I don't think this is just a Putin problem. I think this is a problem of the Russian elites, and behind the Russian elites, I think there is, a population that acquiesces, and it is really too difficult to say where this will end. But I think a lot of it will depend on two things or three things. First, obviously, the success of the Ukrainian military with our support. Second, whether it is possible to deter Putin from escalating to a point where this would become a military conflict that draws in NATO, essentially. And of course, there is a moment where that could be the case. And then third, essentially developments in Russia, right? So I think it is possible to conceive of a situation where the costs of continuing this war effort, on the one hand, are so high that it does not make domestic political sense anymore for Putin, whereas on the other hand, escalation really risks annihilation. And so if you like, the opportunity to end the war, perhaps not in a formal way, but in an informal way, is whether we can find a path where the Russian leaders are caught between these two threats. And at that point, in essence, giving up in some way or the other is the path of least resistance. But again, I'm not an expert in this area.
Well, and my last question, we had the financial crisis in 2008, Lehman Brothers. Then we had the pandemic, now we have the war.
Yes.
Do you see the circle going back and that we can have also a booming time again, like we had after 1995 and 2000, when there was the Eurozone and everything seemed that was going so okay for everyone?
Yeah.
Or can we wait for more years of hardship before the next generation can hope for a better situation?
Look, there's always an upside, right? The upside is one where we manage to preserve globalization, so the world does not split up in two halves. We do it a bit differently, we do it in a more resilient way. The European Union comes out strengthened from this crisis, which is very well possible. And we manage to avoid a retreat of the United States into isolation. So in that kind of world, we have the framework for new prosperity. And the reason why we have this framework is because there is still a big part of the world which is not significantly participating in prosperity, right? So if you like, the boom of the 2000s was driven by two factors. One was the creation of the euro, and of course this had, a great positive effect on many countries by lowering interest rates, by giving them credibility. Unfortunately, we did not see the dark side, and so we went into excesses, credit creation, and government deficits, and overshot, and then we were punished through the euro crisis. But there was this sort of significant institutional advancement. That sort of thing is more difficult to envisage in the future, but it's not impossible. So if we had a success, for example, on fiscal union, that could really sweep away many of the obstacles in the single market. It's just politically even more difficult than the creation of the union, but there is sort of a big prize out there, which is essentially a much better working single market, but that requires I think significantly aligning tax systems, very significantly making fiscal decisions together, right? So if that were to happen, it would be sort of, in a sense, comparable as a boost to the creation of the euro, again with risks that then have to be managed. Then the other big factor behind the boom of the 2000s was essentially the rise of China, right, as a source of external demand for many countries, but particularly for us. So that is gone, I think. The huge growth phase is gone, but there are plenty of other countries in Asia and, hopefully in Africa that could come on stream. So I guess the answer is yes. In principle, I could see sort of golden times come back, but there is an awful lot of stuff that has to come together.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Zettelmeyer. Thank you.
Good. Thank you.